Welcome everybody to our Facebook Live session about French in Louisiana. We're so happy to have you here with us. My name is Terry Hammett, and I've been living in Louisiana since 1984. I taught French and French immersion here in Baton Rouge, and then after that I worked with languages and cultures at the Louisiana Department of Education. And now I'm an instructional strategist here at Wayside Publishing. And so I think you're going to enjoy what we have to offer you today. We are sharing a bit about history here in Louisiana, our Francophone history, the mosaic of peoples that live here in Louisiana, the current Francophone ecosystem that exists here, including CODOFIL and the state of affairs in education. We're also going to take a look at the future of French in Louisiana, and I think it's pretty exciting. So we have some teaching resources available for you. They are not only on our blog, but they will be placed in the chat, so you can see that. And after this Facebook Live session, they will also be available for you with the recording. So let's see. Also, something really interesting that's happened because of COVID, and that is that many of South Louisiana's Table Françaises have actually gone online. And so we've also placed a list of those tables that you can get in touch with and talk to some good Louisiana folks and see what's going on with our Table Françaises throughout South Louisiana, the ones that are online. So we're going to get started right now. I'd like to introduce our panelists. Our first panelist is Peggy Feehan. She is the Executive Director of CODOFIL, the Council for the Development of French in Louisiana. It is the only agency of its kind in the United States for the promotion of a language. So Peggy, would you like to say a few words?
Bonjour, merci Terry for inviting me. I'm really happy to be with everybody, and thank you for Wayside for innovating in that way in this virtual world that we're living in, and happy to be here with my friends. Merci.
Thanks, Peggy. And what's really interesting is that we usually all speak French with each other, so this is really a different experience for us. Our next panelist is Joseph Dunn with Louisiana Perspectives. Joseph has described himself as a polémiste qui appelle un chaoui un chaoui. So he's someone who likes to engage in conversation, and he's not afraid to call a raccoon, whatever that means. So Joseph, would you like to say a few words?
Merci beaucoup, Terry, de m'inviter. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks also to the Wayside for organizing this and allowing us to talk a little bit about Louisiana and to go beyond some of the myths and what we often perceive as misconceptions about what is going on in French and Creole language in Louisiana. So I'm excited to be here with my friends, and as Terry said, it's a little bit odd for us not to be speaking French to each other. So this is an interesting experience for us. So, all right.
So thanks, Joseph. Next, I'd like to introduce Will McGrew. He's our third panelist here today. He is the founder and CEO of Télé Louisiane. He brings lots of expertise, lots of knowledge, and lots of resources. So Will, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Terry. Donc, bonjour vous autres. I'm really happy to be here, also with Joseph and Peggy. A little weird to be speaking English with the two of them and Terry, but I think we'll be able to share some interesting thoughts, not just about French in Louisiana, but also the ways in which we've made language learning interesting and exciting for people of all ages and of all backgrounds here in Louisiana.
So thanks, Will. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to start with Joseph, who will be talking a little bit about the mosaic of people, a little bit about the Francophone history of Louisiana, and please, Will and Peggy, chime in as you see fit. Go ahead, Joseph.
Thanks, Terry. So the first thing I'd like to address is the fact that the way that you learn about Louisiana history and the way that we learn about Louisiana history all happens through a very English-speaking and American filter. And so one of the things that I'm very interested in is flipping those paradigms back and trying to understand the history of this place and the history of its people more through a French-speaking or a Creole-speaking lens. And I mention those two because these two languages always existed in parallel one to the other. And so we'll get a little bit more into that in a bit when we talk about identity with Will. But of course, Louisiana is founded as a French colony back in 1699, and the first colonists were coming from what is now Quebec and also from France. Shortly after that, in the 1720s, the French began importing West African slaves into Louisiana to build the colony. And these West African slaves were coming from different regions and with different language backgrounds. And when they came into contact with French, that gave rise or gave birth to the Louisiana Creole language as we know it here in Louisiana. And interestingly enough, it's much more closely related to the Creole that's spoken in the Indian Ocean, in the island of Mauritius, for example, than it is to those places that are more geographically closely located to us. And that's because the African languages, or the people of the African languages, were the same ones brought here that were taken into the Indian Ocean. So there's that piece. Over time, there are many other immigrant groups that arrive here, either voluntarily or involuntarily. There are going to be Spanish people, there are Swiss people, there are Belgians, there are people coming from all over the place, from the Caribbean. And you might think of Louisiana as a crossroads, a real crossroads of where all of these different things intersect. Europe, the Caribbean, Africa, and Canada all intersect right here in Louisiana. And there are ethnographers and anthropologists who have decided or stated that there are more than a dozen different groups of people here who can claim a French or Creole speaking background. And all of that begins to get really, really muddy over time. So you've heard probably about the Acadians. The Acadians arrive here beginning in 1764-ish, and they keep arriving until about 1785. They're a group of about 3,000 refugees who arrive into an existing French-speaking population. The language of French in Louisiana was not brought here by the Acadians. It's a very common misperception. It already existed here, and so they were absorbed into existing populations. Now, over time, in 1803, Louisiana, you learn in school the Louisiana Purchase. Well, that's an American perspective. When we think about the people who were living here, for them, it was the sale of Louisiana. So the languages that we speak are always going to be informing our relationship to ourselves, to the history, and to the places where we live. Throughout the 19th century, there are more French-speaking people coming here all the time from all over the place, up until the time we get to the early 20th century. But let's rewind just a little bit, because I forgot to mention to you that beginning in 1803, there are all these American immigrants who begin arriving in Louisiana. And the people who are already here think of the Americans as immigrants and foreigners in this former French colony. That sentiment is going to remain very much part of the psyche of these people into the early 20th century. Now, many of them are calling themselves a Creole, and here's another issue that we need to address. When we talk about identity, in the United States, the baseline for identity through an American lens is skin color. Historically in Louisiana, the baseline for identity was not skin color, it was language. And Creoles were the people who spoke French, or spoke Creole, Spanish maybe, they were Roman Catholic, they were Latin. The Americans spoke English and were Protestant. And no matter what color were the Americans, and no matter what color were the Creoles, those were the main identity points. Language for the Creoles, skin color for the Americans. But moving forward into the early 20th century, now we've got all this mosaic of people, remember? Some of them are descendants of formerly enslaved people. Some of them are descendants of immigrants who've come here voluntarily. And even among the enslaved people, you had thousands and thousands and thousands of people here who were also carriers of the French and the Creole languages. But in 1916, public education becomes mandated by state government. Now we are geographically in the American South. Education is going to be segregated. There are schools for the white children, for the black children, and for the Native American children. Among those groups of kids, many of them speak French, they speak Creole, they speak different varieties of these heritage languages, But now they're going to be segregated from their same language peers. And in 1921, the Louisiana State Constitution is going to mandate that English be the only language of classroom education. So what does that mean? That means that these children who were speaking French or Creole or other heritage languages at home now are suddenly going to be forcibly assimilated into English. And so there's going to be created here a very real disconnect, a relational disconnect to their own language and to their own culture. And so when we go to school in Louisiana, no matter that our grandparents or our great-grandparents or our ancestors might have been here since the colonial period speaking these languages, we're going to have to choose a foreign language. That foreign language is French or whatever else. But our labels have all changed. So that has created this really bizarre disconnect to our own identity. So moving forward to today, we have roughly between 100 and 200,000 people in Louisiana who are still full or partial speakers of heritage languages. And so what we're trying to do collectively is reintroduce these ideas of speaking language in public places, speaking language in business, and creating these kinds of ecosystems that are socially, professionally, and economically valorizing for the carriers of our heritage languages.
Thank you, Joseph. I've never seen you talk so slowly.
Well, yeah. You know, that's always my critique. I speak too fast.
No, that was great. Will, do you have something to add?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it was super interesting, and obviously, like, a lot of these conversations have to start with history. And for me, especially, that was one of the things that got me most excited about Louisiana French. I learned French originally when I was in high school, and my mom and my grandmother spoke French. But I still thought, and I understood that it was important, and a lot of the like associations and organizations that I was a part of, or contests that I participated in, existed because we were in Louisiana. But I still did like view French for much of my life as a foreign language. And then it wasn't until later that I started understanding that although we think of Louisiana, the way I think the general narrative is told about Louisiana's history is that like there was the Louisiana Purchase, and then after that, Louisiana was quickly anglicized and quickly assimilated into the American culture. But actually, we know if you like read the real history, like Joseph summarized, Louisiana continued to have millions, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of French and Creole speakers for decades after the sale of Louisiana or the Louisiana Purchase. And even today, we continue to have several hundred thousand and an even larger population that feels some connection to the language, whether it's because their grandparents or parents spoke it, and or because they are participating in some other aspect of Louisiana culture that is fundamentally linked to the language. So whether that's like our food or our festivals or our music, right, it's very much all of that. People don't realize that was created, almost all of the jazz, all the traditions we love was created in French in Louisiana. So yeah, I think the historical piece is really great, and I think there's a lot of work to do both for educating Louisianans and people from elsewhere about what Louisiana is really all about.
Yeah, thanks, Will. Peggy, add?
I would add that we said things. Joseph said like there's between 100 and 200,000 French or speakers in Louisiana, and I'm wondering if some people out there are wondering why can't they find out exactly? But it's really tricky because if you ask an old person that speaks French, that spoke French as a first language, what language they speak, usually because they've been kind of ridiculed for speaking French, they're going to say they speak English, and they kind of put away the French. And also because most of them don't read or write French, some of them, a lot of them, because either they forgot or they never learned, they don't feel like they don't consider themselves French speakers. So I don't think we'll ever get a true picture of the number of people that still speak French in Louisiana. and that number is much higher than the numbers that the census will give us. Just a side note.
So that's interesting, Peggy. To go a little bit deeper into that, I have some friends who have come to visit us in Louisiana, and they expect to hear French. Why the three of you, why do you think somebody might return home after visiting Louisiana and saying, they don't speak French anymore?
Well, we get that critique like at the office here. Sometimes people come and they're disappointed that, well, we didn't see anybody that speaks French, and we heard people speaking Spanish. And the thing is that the French speakers also speak English, and they've learned to speak English in a public place. And we're doing things to try to counter that, but it's the petit pas, you know. We can't. We have to go slow because everybody moves slow, but we certainly have initiatives where we're trying to focus on getting the French out. And I mean, French is my first language. I know you're hearing it, but for a lot of people here, they just, can you imagine speaking French for 10 years of your life and then English for 60 years of your life? So it's kind of hard to break a habit to going back in French. So that's why we're trying to make people at ease and tell them to speak, prends ta place à la table, and do like you're doing around your kitchen table, but outside, open the curtains, open the door, and let it flow. Speak French, bring it back. So I don't know what Joseph, a former director of CODOFIL, and I know he's worked towards that same goal that I'm working with my team, but it's hard, but we're trying.
I think one of the things that we should think about, and I've imagined this in my head, lots and lots, to understand that what has happened is that after the Second World War, moving into the 1950s and the 1960s, as consumerism ramped up, as radio and television became prevalent, the carrot, if you will, to economic and social success was the English language. So the default language has become English. And as the default language became English, when we talk about these ecosystems, language exists in contextual situations. And if you don't have a French language supermarket, or you don't go to church in French, or go to the doctor in French, all of those different pieces of the linguistic ecosystem become eroded over time. And so, as Peggy was saying, someone who spoke French up until the time they were 10 years old, well, they don't have all of the linguistic building blocks to speak French in those different situations and be comfortable in them, for example. So, having those different kinds of spaces where the language is audible and visible is something that we're trying to imagine as we move forward in this process.
Thanks, Joseph and Peggy. Let's see. I wanted to remind the audience that you are welcome to send us any questions through the chat, and we'll pass them on to our panelists if you have any questions that you'd like to ask. Also, let's see. Peggy, would you talk a little bit about what's going on with CODOFIL initiatives, a little bit about education, things like that?
Oui, madame. So, CODOFIL, like you said, is a Council for the Development of French in Louisiana. We are a state agency. We depend upon the government. We are in the culture part of the Department of Culture, CRT, Culture, Recreation, and Tourism. We are really if you think, we're the only one in the state, in the country like this. Think about a Bureau of Indian Affairs. Well, that's what we are, but for the French language in Louisiana. We were created in 1968 by a congressman from here. His name was Jimmy DiMaggio. And Mr. DiMaggio had a dream to save the French in Louisiana. And it was a law that was passed in the legislature here in Baton Rouge to create CODOFIL. And then one of the ways to save French was to teach it in the schools. So while on a trip to France and a visit with President de Gaulle, Monsieur de Mangio said to the president, like, look, and he told him to, like the two form, tu dois nous aider, or we're screwed in Louisiana, we need your help. And then, so from 1972, French teachers starting to arrive in Louisiana. At first, they were chartered planes full of teachers that would land in Baton Rouge, and school bus would come and pick them up and bring them to the four corners of the state. So that was in 72 when the teaching started in the schools. And then in 1982, French immersion started in our in elementary schools. And it kind of stayed quasi-stagnant for a lot of years, but since 2016, we are seeing an expansion of French immersion program in the state. If we look at numbers for the state right now, we have about 35 schools in about 12 parishes. That's what we call counties here in Louisiana. We have about 5,500 students right now in our elementary school programs. Since 2016, that's about a 20% increase, and we grow a little bit every year, like 1 or 2 new schools per year. And then the schools that start, they add on a grade every year. So we always have a little more students every year like this. Now we have about 35 students in French education, K-12, but that's not immersion, that's French as a second language. And how do we do this? Well, we have accords with countries like France and Belgium, where we go and recruit our French teachers, because we're still not in Louisiana producing enough French teachers. Although for 10 years, we've had a program that we called Escadrille, and that program is taking young Louisiana folks that have a bachelor's degree, and we send them to France for a year. They work on a master's while they're there. And then, long story short, they come back and they're French teachers. We have about 30 teachers in the schools right now that come from that program. It's not many, but it's better than nothing. It's 30 more than we didn't have 10 years ago. And that also is growing a little bit every year. Now, because of COVID, it's kind of on the ice right now. We don't know yet if the program will be going forward for the fall. We're acting as if, but for that, we need international travel, and we might need to be a little, I don't know, we'll see. If maybe it'll work, maybe it won't, maybe it'll work with, maybe we'll make some changes for the fall, but anyway. So, and then why, Joseph talked a little bit about the dollar signs, you know, if it makes sense economically to speak French or English. Well, in Louisiana, I have a number here that's really interesting. In 2017, the French money, the French tourist money that came to Louisiana was $34 million. So there is definitely an economic advantage to Louisiana to have French out there and to speak French. So that's a little bit of the education side. CODOFIL does not just do education. We have actually have 6 legislative mandates. Most of them are in education, but we also have one, and I'm looking at my screen right now because it's legislative jargon, but it's we have one of the mandate is in the expansion of the state's economic development and tourism activities. So we do work in tourism and economy. And then one mandate that we have that's very interesting and that I invite the watchers to go see, especially if they visit Louisiana, is a new initiative that we started a couple of years ago that's called the We, as in yes, we initiative. You can access it online at www.codofil.org/we, OUI. And the goal of that is to recenser, help me out here. Thank you. To identify French businesses or French services. And it's kind of twofold. It is for, we have two target audience. We want the local people to be able to advertise themselves if they have French speakers in their business or they have services in French. And it's also for the tourists that come, that if they want to have a cafe in French, well, they can go, and we have a searchable database, and they can write like cafe, and then they'll know where they can go. And there's a French barista or barista that speaks French somewhere at a certain place. And that's just like a basic example, but that's basically what the We Initiative website is doing. That it's constantly evolving, obviously, because things change, and then but we are adding to the database. And if we also welcome input from the public, that if somebody finds a French something, that we can add it to the database. And then another thing that we do here at CODOFIL is that we work very closely with legislators when we need help from them to pass legislation. For example, there's a French Immersion Act, which is if parents from a district have a signature petition with 25 signatures on it, and they submit to the school board, well, the school board has to implement French immersion in their district. It's more complicated than that, but that's one example of a law that we suggested, and we work with the legislators to have passed. We have another one where we created guidelines for the Blue School French immersion program type thing, where we listed very high, rigorous bullet, a long list of what needs to happen to have a really excellent program. And we have 20 schools so far that have achieved that blue ribbon type status. We work with the legislator also for a CODOFIL Day in the legislature, that not this year because of COVID, but every year we have our day where we go and talk with our friends in the legislature, and they always pass how do you say that? Proclamation. Thank you. And they do that in French in the legislature because it's an official language. Technically not, but it's accepted in the legislature to speak French. So, and yeah, that's about what we do here. And then we're happy to be out of confinement and back in the office. Yes.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to ask you about that We initiative. Is that part of Franco Responsabilité?
Yes, well, when it started, actually in the law, it's called Franco Responsable, or I'm trying to see.
French friendly. It's called French friendly in the legislation.
French friendly, and we kind of changed the name and call it We, the We Initiative, because we have to be responsible, but when we think about responsibility, it's kind of hard work. So maybe we need to give it a friendlier name, and it's easier to remember. So the We Initiative is really the Franco Responsable, or the French friendly initiative, and it's better on the logo. But that's about what we do here at CODOFIL. And Joseph, you're the former director, and Will, you're part of that new generation, even though you weren't in French immersion. But we strive on people like you, obviously, to help us but what we do out there.
If I might, I would like to just go a little bit further into a couple of things that Peggy was talking about. When de Mongeau had his idea to put French back in the schools, it wasn't to make French the language of instruction, it was to put French in as a second language. So there's one of the things that's a great misconception and a great myth in Louisiana is that there were never any French language schools here. And so there's a relational disconnect here between what it is to have a classroom that all of the subject matter is taught and consumed in a target language versus having a language as a subject matter. So up until 1921, of course, they weren't available everywhere, but there were French language schools in Louisiana. So there were people in Louisiana, white, black, Creole, of Acadian descent, who were fully literate in French. They were producing literature. They were reading and writing newspapers. All of that existed here until 1921. And in 1921, when the language of instruction flipped to French, we lost that. So there's lots of things that we have forgotten in English about our history. And so when CODOFIL started, and Peggy mentioned the early 1970s, French is put back into the schools as a subject matter and not as the language of instruction. So moving forward up until the early 1980s when the immersion idea took hold, so now we have instruction in French, all right? So I just wanted to give that little bit of nuance and clarity to that question.
Thanks, Joseph. I'd like to say something for teachers out there as well. I want to go back to the We Initiative and also talk just a little bit about the Franco-Responsable, because I think that's something that some of our teachers can use when they're talking about French as a world language in the classroom. And the reason I'm saying that is Spanish is all over the place, okay? It's a wonderful language, it's all over. And parents are choosing Spanish as opposed to French because they see it everywhere. Well, if we are responsible and French friendly, we will also speak in French to one another. It's making a statement like, this is important to me. And so here in Louisiana, as the four of us have said, we speak to each other in French, okay? 3 of us are native English speakers. But I think that's something that teachers can share in their classes. It's a point of interculturality. And I think it's an important point. So I just wanted to bring that up. Joseph, let's see, did you want to speak a little bit about the ecosystem and what's missing a little bit here in what we're trying to do in Louisiana?
Sure. So this whole idea of ecosystem that I mentioned just a few minutes ago, this idea of language existing in different contexts. So as we moved through the 20th century, all right, specifically after the Second World War, and then we began to see all of these different spaces replaced by English. Church, the grocery store, the post office, all of those places that you go and where you absorb language, where you acquire language, where you don't learn language, because we're constantly in this state of linguistic acquisition. We hear new words and we hear new phrases and we hear new ways of saying things every day, and unconsciously, subconsciously, we just automatically integrate them into the way that we talk, into our speech. And so all of those spaces where people would absorb French naturally just began to disappear. And so how do we look at different spaces and bringing French back into those spaces so that it is a language of social interactivity, it's a language of consumption? And I'll come back to the points about the Spanish speakers. The reason that we hear Spanish spoken so much is because there is incredible consumer and political power behind the Spanish language speakers. And so what's happened is society conforms to that because there's that huge money behind it. So how can we take that example here in Louisiana and even elsewhere, and turn that into a social and an economic machine. One of our great big challenges here is the issue of racial segregation. And so I mentioned earlier that there's this great mosaic of people. So what's happened, especially being in the American South, everyone who spoke French and who spoke Creole has been segregated one from the other. And so it's very hard or quite a challenge to get people together to see themselves with under the same cultural and linguistic umbrella, as opposed to someone different with a different skin color. And so if we combined all those people still together today in Louisiana, we'd have a rather important group of people speaking French. So did that answer your question, Terry?
Yes, yes. Thank you, Joseph. Actually, we have a question here that's come in, and it is addressed to Joseph. It's, do you think if history teachers and French teachers in school teach students about Louisiana's French-speaking troops in World War II, we would have more of a pride for the language, since many of the people who did that were from Louisiana?
I think it's an absolute certainty that we need to have those kinds of things in school. There's also a generational disconnect to that piece now, though, unfortunately, because most of the people who did that are no longer with us. Even though there have been some movies written about it, there are books written about that. It's World War II is very far in the past for students today. Yeah, we need to know about it. People need to know about it. It does help. But, you know, I also think we need to be looking at things that are relevant today, especially when we're talking about young people. What are those things that are really interesting to young people, and how can we use pop culture, cool things to get them interested in our languages and speaking them again?
Good point, which brings us into something else. Before we move on to our last topic here, but speaking of the younger generation, is there a rebirth of French in Louisiana, so that the young people who are in immersion or who are learning French just because they're learning French, are they speaking it to their kids?
Nous en sommes quelques-uns à le faire, en fait. Some of us are, actually. And for those of us who are really engaged and committed to it, I think, yes, it's happening. But it's a conscious choice of every minute, and it's not easy because we don't live in a francophone bubble. Our media is all in English. I mean, we have to make conscious choices about using this language, and I don't like the concept of teaching one's own children to speak a language. We don't teach our children to speak a language, no matter what language it is. We don't hold our babies in our arms and conjugate verbs to them. We simply speak to them. And so they absorb language naturally. So I like the word language acquisition. I don't like the word language learning when we're talking about our children or our grandchildren.
Thank you, Joseph. And that's what we're all about with Proficiency Talks. That's what we talk about. Okay, I have another question that's just come in. I have heard people say they can't understand their grandchildren's French because it's not the same as the Cajun French they speak. Is there any truth to this complaint?
Who's going to tackle that one?
Yeah.
Peggy, Peggy, I think it makes more sense.
Well, I mean, I don't think I don't think it's true. I think okay, there might be true elements to it, because when a kid starts kindergarten, and if their teacher is from Belgium and they learn a certain vocabulary with the teacher's accent, yes, at that point it might be foreign to the grandparents. But that's kind of telling the grandparents are just like, they only understand this, and I don't think that's true either. I think it's kind of diminishing the French speakers when we say that. And I don't think it's true, because I grew up with one French, but I certainly understand somebody from Paris and somebody from Brussels and somebody from Montreal. And then there's probably some words that if I went to a certain region of France that they would speak, and I would be like, oh, je comprends pas. I don't know, we don't all have everybody's patois in our vocabulary. So if it is true, for a kindergarten student, I would say that by the time he's reached 5th grade and had a teacher from Louisiana, from France, and from Haiti, and from Quebec, and from La Réunion, by that time they've touched all the lexic and all the accents, and I don't see that they would have any problems communicating with their grandparents. I don't know. Joseph, what do you think, or Will?
I mean, I tend to think, I agree with you, Peggy. I think it's predominantly a psychological thing. One of the issues is that even after like the Cajun Renaissance in the 60s and 70s, the powers that be in the education system kind of continue to view French, with exceptions, right? Immersion teachers and the people working on immersion and CODOFIL continue to view French as kind of like Louisiana French, Cajun French, Creole French as folkloric. And so as a result, and that message was promoted for decades, really. And so a lot of elderly people who speak French, kind of, when they hear a standard accent, it's kind of like shocking or triggering, or kind of they have a mental block a little bit. But if you kind of push through that, and like Peggy's saying, and you start speaking about, oh, there's different dialects of French, and you change the narrative that our dialect is just as legitimate as the Quebecois dialect or the Acadian dialect, et cetera, and you insist, then you start realizing that it's really just an accent difference in terms of, do you roll your R's, or is it a ra, in a few words, but then after that, it's very mutually intelligible. It's definitely I hear it all the time in the reverse direction, where people say, oh, well, I speak real French, but I was out in Arnaudville and I couldn't hear anything. I'm like, okay, well, I learned standard French too, in school and then in France, and I'm out in Arnaudville and in Cutoff and, Mamu and all these towns, and I understand what everyone's saying. So there is some truth to it, but it's mainly psychological.
I'll agree with that. And I'll also come back to this idea of context and situations and erosion of ecosystem. It's a question of exposure, all right? How many of your children watch cartoons with the kids in the cartoons who speak with the European or British accent and they understand them perfectly? It's a question simply of exposure. And so 100 years ago, all of these people in Louisiana who were speaking these various dialects and registers of French and Creole all understood each other. Mm-hmm. All of them understood each other because they were exposed all of the time to all of these varieties. And so what's happened over the last 100 years or so is that exposure to those different varieties hasn't continued. And so the moment that they hear something that's a little bit different, or a word that's not said exactly the same, because, as Will was saying, from Arnaudville to Cutoff to here, there, and yonder around the state, you've got very different varieties. I mean, down in Cutoff, you can recognize that immediately. In Lower Lafourche Parish, they aspirate their J's. They'll say he mangé instead of j'ai mangé. And so immediately you know that. But if you've not been exposed to it, it's going to completely throw you off.
Okay.
I'll just, one follow-up just to what you said. I wasn't aware of this aspirated J until recently. We had the opportunity to interview Ed Orgeron, the coach of LSU, his mother, and it was a new accent for us because effectively she's from the Bayou parishes, specifically Lafourche, and basically, yeah, it's so fascinating that within one state, but we still were able to communicate perfectly.
So that brings us into the future. Will, can you talk to us a little bit about what you see as a young person for the future of French in Louisiana?
Yeah, for sure. And it definitely, it builds a lot off of what Peggy and Joseph were talking about. Because the way I see it is that I'm very grateful for the fact that we still have French speakers in Louisiana, that we have French immersion, we have French education, we have certain like Francophone associations. But a lot of to Joseph's point, a lot of the infrastructure is missing. And so a lot of times, like I have friends in French Canada or the Basque, El País Vasco, the Basque Country or Catalunya, where they had a similar like renaissance in the 60s and 70s and 80s. But since then, they have a whole kind of global ecosystem for their regional language. So you have education, media, economy, government, and a variety of laws and also private sector practices that protect and maintain the language. And
funding.
So, what?
And funding.
Yeah, and funding, of course, yeah. And in Louisiana, we're missing a lot of that. We have the educational piece, which is great, but we're missing kind of that full infrastructure. And so Joseph kind of talked about that. And then the other thing that I think we're missing is to some extent, we're missing the identity piece. And in terms of these other examples, whether you look at French Canada, Acadians, Quebec, or you look at European examples, the Basque Country, Scotland, Wales, Catalonia, like I said, they also did a much better job of making the case for why are we distinct as a region, or in some places they consider themselves to be a nation, and why is the language fundamental to that? And so for us, I think for young people, we've kind of integrated, and a lot of those critiques were some like people like Joseph and in the generation above mine were kind of making some of those critiques to the original infrastructure around CODOFIL and saying, okay, we need to make a Louisiana-based infrastructure so that we can actually sustain over the long term. A lot of that has now trickled down to my generation, and it's really the generation of a lot of immersion kids, like a lot of the people that work with me in Louisiana are immersion kids, but then also just young Louisianans who are in this unique situation where we have grandparents and parents who authentically practice the culture or authentically speak the language, but we realize that if an infrastructure isn't built up around it, there's a significant risk that the language will die. And so, or both languages, both Louisiana Creole and Louisiana French. And so basically, like, I think just to kind of conclude of how we're approaching that through Telelu is that we realize that Telelu can serve the community not just from an infrastructure perspective. And so we cannot just create content in French so people can consume content. I see one of the questions is where can people hear Louisiana French speakers? If you go to our YouTube channel, you can hear a lot of different dialects, a little bit of Louisiana Creole, some standard French, and there's a variety of other YouTube channels too. There's the infrastructure point, which we need, because you need to be able to consume the language in order for you to be able to, for the language to exist. But then secondly, the identity piece is key. And so this is the argument of saying, expanding the community around French in Louisiana, because previously it had been basically Cajuns, people, well, not even Cajuns, certain people who identify as Cajuns, and then certain people who identify as Creoles. And then also less active in the movement, but still continuing to speak French, a variety of local indigenous tribes, most notably the United Homa Nation. But different from what happened this is the last thing I'll say, it's just different from what happened in Quebec or in Acadie. There was this communitarism of French, and it said, oh, French is just a special thing for the Cajuns. But really, until recently, French was the lingua franca of all of Louisiana. And so for our approach, we're trying to reclaim French as an indelible part of our cultural fabric, and an indelible part of what makes us different and special as Louisiana. And then just on that point, on the Spanish point, I think that's a key point here, where it's like, we'll never be our value add will never be that we're fully bilingual Spanish, right? Because there's a variety of other states who are way ahead of us and have a much larger Hispanic population and therefore a much larger infrastructure to build that up. Alternatively, we're ahead of the game in terms of French. Like, we have the most French immersion schools, we have the most French speakers proportionally. And so as a result, if we capitalize on that as part of saying we're promoting English and French, and of course Spanish and all other languages, but then we can actually have more of a value add. Because right, like that is already part of our brand. And if we reinforce it, there's a lot of promise and potential.
And I just wanted to tag on to what Will was saying with the Cajun and the Creole pieces. What everybody has to understand, which is one of our big challenges here, is that those labels are completely racialized and they are polarized. And so in each of those, under each of those Cajun or Creole labels, there are French speakers and there are Creole speakers. There are Cajuns who actually speak Creole, and there are Creoles who actually speak Louisiana French, because ethno-racial genealogical identity and language spoken are not synonymous. And so there again is this huge complexity of things. And I'm a huge proponent of this idea of identity building. You know, it's a challenge because, so let's say we have a kid in Louisiana who's Asian in a French immersion school. The teacher is from Mali in Western Africa, and our curriculum is American translated into French, taught by a Malian to an Asian who has no Louisiana sort of benchmarks for culture or history or that sort of thing. How do we build identity in French and anchor that student who will become a carrier of that language here in Louisiana into the future? So yeah, these are the questions that keep me up at night.
Yeah. I'd like to share one thing, kind of going full circle. There was, as we've talked about a little bit, there was a group of an indigenous tribe here in Louisiana that was building a community center. And the French government said that they would help them build a community center. And they had an architect all picked out, and the land, they were getting ready to purchase the land for this community center. And the non-indigenous people of the town did not want the tribe to get the property. And so the cost of the property went way up, and it was impossible for them to purchase the property. So there was a big powwow that took place between the French consulate in New Orleans, came and had a meeting with the tribe, and they were all meeting together. And lo and behold, the mayor of the town shows up, and he was kind of behind the whole thing about not allowing the Native Americans to get the property. And he looked very surprised when he saw the French government and the Indians together, and he said to the Native Americans, he said, "How long have you been working with these French people?" And the Native American looked at him and said, "About 300 years." So you can see, you know, we go full circle. We're looking ahead, and we have our roots behind us to keep us strong. So let's see. I think we have one more. We have another comment here. I'm excited when I see the new street signs and informational signs in many communities that are in English and in French. Also nice to see the bienvenue signs when one drives into Louisiana from another state. Just a beginning, but nice. I have heard French on the radio when traveling around Louisiana. Is there a good resource for those of us who might want to hear French from Louisiana, whether we're in Louisiana or not?
Yes, I would say, so obviously I'm going to plug like the Television YouTube page. So, but just I'll list a few. So there's the Television YouTube page. If you go to LPB en français, it'll have the Louisiana Public Broadcasting's en français show from the 80s, I believe. Then KVPI, the Ville Platte radio station, has a show in French called La Tasse du Café. Then KRVS, which is public radio in Lafayette, has a show, several shows, I think, in French. Then there's K-Bon, which also has radio in French. And then there's Cajun Music Radio, which is also in French. And then Facebook groups, I recommend the Cajun French Virtual Table Française, and then also if you're interested in Louisiana Creole, the Louisiana Creole Coudivini practice group. And they both have videos in there. Also the Cajun French video lessons. So lots of resources. Like if you Google, and then also I know there's a blog associated with this seminar that has a lot of the resources as well.
Awesome. Yes, great. Now we have another young member of the Louisiana Francophone family who actually lives with Joseph, Joseph's daughter, Amélie. Amélie, would you like to join us for just a few minutes?
Hello.
Bonjour, Amélie. Bonjour. So we're going to ask you to talk in English if you don't mind.
I don't mind.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you feel French has brought you? You've been in an immersion program, I think.
Yes, I was from 3rd to 7th grade.
And
it was really beneficial for me to just like be able to practice it at home and at school. But a lot of the other students did not get to practice the language at home, which then like kind of stumped them, I guess, in a way. So I'm really lucky to have been able to practice it in both settings.
Uh-huh. Great. Okay, you have anything else you want to add? I think you've done some internships with the French consulate, and French has really opened up some opportunities for you.
Yes, it definitely has. I just went to Canada for Paris Pour, and for the French consulate, we did a little internship and we got to see a lot of the behind the scenes stuff that they do, which was really interesting, and it opens doors.
Yeah, it opens doors, and I think that's what we all want for Louisiana, right? We want to open doors to the outside world. So we have just a few minutes, just like a couple minutes. If anybody would like to finish up, I do want to say one thing. Please check the chats. That's where all of the information is, all of the resources, some teaching resources and information, and our blogs. I want to thank our guests so much. Joseph, Peggy, Will, any final words you'd like to say?
I was just very happy with this conversation. I enjoy talking with Joseph and Will any chance I get, and also with you, Terry. I've known you for, I don't even know how long, but it's like a little family reunion here, family friends. We don't get to see one another, but it's certainly nice to do this in a professional setting and having it recorded and out on the face world. Oh my God, now it's all true, right? Because it's on Facebook.
I think it bears noting and stating that Terry, in her time at the Louisiana Department of Education, was one of the principal carriers and institutors of our French as a second language environments and our French immersion environments. And in many cases, she was carrying that almost by herself. So if French is alive and well and progressing in Louisiana today, Terry is one of the people who is in large part responsible for that. So Terry, merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup. Yeah, thanks. But it is, it's a joint effort. So it's a team effort. I do have one last thing to say to the three of you, and that is Jean-Philippe Warlet says bonjour la Louisiane.
Philippe.
Could I just say one last thing too?
Yes.
Yeah, because the one thing I would just say is that if people are watching and are interested in like learning more about Louisiana French, like you can feel free to message us on Facebook, Louisiana, and we can send you even more resources. And then the other thing is that, to both Joseph's and Peggy's point, it's like, or I think Nietzsche said, a language is a dialect with an army. And so in Louisiana, where I use the term a lot, like nation building a little bit, we're trying to build this community and infrastructure and identity around French. And if you're from elsewhere, you can help us by coming to visit, trying to speak French, and going to the Franco Responsable website and supporting French businesses. And then also, if you're an educator, doing exchanges with some of our local Francophone institutions, whether it's the Alliance Française, the Immersion School, Saint-Luc French Immersion Campus, because that really helps us, build this community, build this nation here that is economically self-sustaining, that can make a pitch to the powers that be that it's worth it to keep French alive in Louisiana.
Amen. Thanks. Okay. Okay, I think we're getting ready to stop here. Merci beaucoup aux panélistes. Panel. Yeah. Okay.
À bientôt. Merci encore.
Salut.